on the way.
Mm.
And we'll introduce Jesper Kurt-Nielsen. He is the curator of the ethnographical collection at the National Museum in Copenhagen. And he recently published a book, The Man Who Would Not Be Polite. Unfortunately, it's only available in Danish, but I bought the ebook version because the pictures in it are really special. They're made by Ho Teng Lin, and he made them in the Nias villages. And the book is about Agner Møller, and he lived there from 1923, and he collected 850 objects for the museum. There will be an article in Tribal Art magazine about this book, but we're not sure yet when it will appear. And we'll have fun with this lecture. The word is to you, Jesper.
Thank you very much. And Finette, thank you very much for inviting me to do this lecture. It's also fascinating to talk about things that has your own interest. And I've had a huge interest in our Nias collection. Strangely enough, I am in fact curator for Africa, for India and the Middle East. But I've always had an interest in our Nias collection. In the National Museum of Denmark, we have a very old collection. And I think I'll start by explaining why it's so big and so well known in Denmark. The collection in the National Museum of Denmark actually goes back to 1600. It was actually collected by Ole Worm, a Danish doctor, who made a private treasure chamber, and he sold it after some years to the Danish king, King Frederik III, and that basically were and is the foundation of our collection here in Copenhagen. So it goes back many years. The Nias collection is of course much younger than that, but it's quite interesting that we have a Nias collection. Because Denmark was never a huge colonial power. We did, of course, had trade posts in India, and we had in the Gold Coast and the West Indies, the Danish West Indies, the present Virgin Islands were in fact Danish. And of course, we had the Arctic possession, which is Greenland, the Faroe Island, and Iceland. But Denmark was, due to war and had become a very small country in the end of the 1800 and 1900 century. A succession of wars which Denmark lost meant that Denmark was a very small nation. It was also a very poor nation after the war with the Germans in 1864, and a lot of young Danish men who wanted to make a career and earn money, they could not find work in Denmark unless they had the right connections, and very few had. So they had to work abroad. And because Denmark was so insignificant, we didn't have a huge navy or a huge army. Danes were actually allowed to work in all European colonial possessions. So you would find that there were Danes everywhere. There's actually a joke about it in ethnographical museums about how there were Danes everywhere. And when I started researching Nias, I thought there was only one, Dr. Møller. There had actually been 4 Danish doctors working on Nias. The Danes working all over the world actually meant that when they came home, they very often donated objects to the National Museum, or when they were stationed outside Denmark in the colonies of other European nations, they were very often asked by the National Museum to collect objects. Because the National Museum of Denmark, even though it was very old and it's very large, they didn't have the funding to produce very large expeditions. And this is actually how Agner Møller emerges on the scene, collecting for the National Museum. And I will tell you later on how that happened. Agner Møller, he was a complicated person. Let me start by saying that. And that is also why I've called my book The Man Who Wouldn't Be Polite. And I have to talk a little about his personality, because that's actually part of the story about how he ended up on Nias. As a young man, he was very much influenced by his parents, and they believed in the supernatural, and so he was involved in sort of a very, how should one say, a world that was outside the normal realm of Danish culture. At the time, approximately 90% of the Danish population was members of the same church. And at the same time, Agner Møller and his family, they were experimenting with the supernatural. And this influenced Agner a great deal. So he became actually more and more eccentric. He was also very, very early on interested in nudism, and he was also interested in a vegetarian lifestyle as early as in the 1910s and in the 20s. And he was also, unfortunately, very fascinated by totalitarian ideologies, which was also seen as very eccentric in Denmark. So he was not a very well-liked person, to be honest. And he also had this personal philosophy that one should not be polite. He thought that was, you know, you should show your true self. It gave him huge problems, not least when he attended medical school. He actually married his own cousin, and they had a couple of children. And in 1922, he decided to travel to Dutch East India. And he did that without consulting with his family and his wife. And you can see him on the photograph here in his Dutch uniform. It wasn't really difficult for a Danish doctor to travel to Dutch East India to become a doctor. They lacked professionals in the colony. So the Dutch, or the Netherlands, they actually advertised in Danish newspapers for people to travel to the colony to work, especially if they had a background in the medical profession. So it was very easy for Agner Møller to go to East India. And it's quite interesting because there was actually quite a lot of Danes in Dutch East India. There were more Danes employed there from 1915 until 1925 than there were collectively in the Danish West Indies, in Greenland, in the Faroe Islands, in Iceland, in Siam, and in some of the Danish colleges in India. And this was all places where the Danish doctors who wanted to go abroad traditionally would go. But to imagine that there were even more in Dutch East India is quite interesting. And why did the Danes go there? Well, you know, if you were a medical doctor in Denmark, you would have a great future in Denmark. But there was this element of, you know, living the adventurous life. But it's also been said by a British historian that a lot of people who went on expeditions or went out in the colonies, they were actually fleeing Europe, but they were also fleeing, you know, maybe a bad marriage, maybe a bad economy, maybe they had a gambling debt, and you know, some of them were actually fleeing themselves. And Agner Møller was actually probably fleeing himself because he was such a complicated person, and he thought when he was going to Dutch East India, everything would be better. He brought his wife, and they had 2 children, and their marriage was not very good, and ended in a terrible mess. And he had problems very early on with his supervisors, and at one point he was stationed at Java because everyone started by being centrally stationed, and he was treating a child, probably a local child, who died, even though the Dutch nurses said she has malaria. He wouldn't listen because he was the man who wouldn't be polite, and he wouldn't listen to other people as well. So the child died. Normally you would be stationed, you know, a place like Sumatra or Borneo. Quite a lot of the Danish doctors wanted to go to Borneo because they would have to be stationed there a couple of years before they came back to Java. But being on Borneo, everyone thought was very, very adventurous. But Agner Møller was actually punished. So he was sent to Nias, this little island west of Sumatra, and it was a punishment because there wasn't a large Dutch settlement, and it was also dangerous. Not so much because of the locals. The southern villages where Agner Møller was stationed had been pacified as late as 1917. But it was more because of malaria. You were only allowed to be there for 1 year, and then you had to be transferred because of the danger of malaria. He actually stayed on for 4 years. And I've been there a couple of times, and it's a very interesting place, not least in the south, because quite a lot of the villages are quite intact. And you know, they had a huge earthquake in I think it was in 2005, and fortunately I was there in 2003, photographed 13 of the villages, and some of those photographs was actually reused to sort of rebuild some of the villages. But quite a lot of the villages in the south are still intact and stand more or less as when Agner Møller visited the villages. It's a very exciting place. Agner Møller immediately loved the place. He didn't like the Europeans, and he didn't like the Dutch. It's quite interesting that we know today how the Danes looked upon the Dutch, and as I just said to Finette before we started, that you know, for Danes, the language in Holland is not that difficult for us to learn, and in many ways, culturally, Denmark and Holland are in many ways the same. But there were differences, and there was one Danish doctor who wrote about the Dutch that he said, well. And he wrote this in the mid-20s. He said, the Dutch, they like us Danes, and it's quite interesting to work for the Dutch, but they are like heavy cavalry, and we are more like hoplites, light infantry. And he said, our relationship is we are like a little cuddly dog that everyone likes, but we are cuddly little dog that are in a cage with a huge, playful, but also hungry bear. So the Danes sometimes found the Dutch culture to be difficult to understand, and they also, most of them found that the way the Dutch colonialism was, how should I say, they found the Dutch were hard people, and Agner Møller sort of took the side of the local people on Nias, which is quite interesting because that's probably why his collecting of objects were so successful. He among other things, learned not only Bahasa Indonesia, he learned to speak the local language of the Nias people. He also married a local girl, which also tells you how complicated a person he was, because he forgot to divorce his wife. She left quite early on with the children. Just before she left, she had an affair with a Dutch officer, but she left, and Agner Møller actually married Soeri, as you can see on the photograph, gave him huge problems when he brought her home to Denmark after he left the colony. But it meant that when he were in Nias, that he was very integrated with the locals. He spoke the languages, he was locally married, and he also began to believe what the locals believed, astrology. He actually later tried to write a doctoral thesis about the Niasian belief. It was rejected because he obviously believed in it himself. The Dutch officials, they complained that he spent so much time with the locals, but he went on quite a lot of expeditions and traveled around the villages. And as I said in the beginning, that the National Museum were not able to send that many expeditions to collect. So what they often did were they wrote a letter to people who were stationed in all these colonies and asked, could you collect some objects for us? And we will, of course, pay for the objects, but we can't pay for your salary. And Thomas Thomsen, who was the chief curator in the ethnographical department in Denmark, he wrote a letter to, I think, the chemist in Manden, and he didn't have the time, but his cousin was actually Agner Møller, who was on Nias. And Agner Møller said, yes, of course, I'll do that. And they very often did that because of patriotic reasons. But Agner Møller did it because he was personally interested in this culture. Now, in Denmark, in the National Museum, there's a tradition not to collect art objects or very spectacular objects. The tradition is that we collect objects that will give you a broad image of the culture involved in the collection. And Agner Møller did that as well. So it's not all about forefather figures, as you can see on this photograph. It's actually the original photograph that were taken on a glass plate when the objects arrived at the museum in Copenhagen. But he tried to collect objects that will give the audience in Denmark a sort of an image of how is the culture on the southern parts of Nias. So it's quite a large collection. It's approximately, or it's not approximately, it is 850 objects. Quite interestingly, he also wanted to have photographs taken of this culture. He was promised 250 kroner from Thomas Thomsen to buy objects for, and in the end he ended up spending 11,000 Danish kroner, which was quite an impressive amount at the time. And one of the reasons were that Agner Møller got into a cooperation with the local Chinese photographer, Ho Teng Lin. I wish I could show you a photograph of him, but I've never found a photograph of this Chinese photographer. It was not unusual to have a Chinese photographer on Nias or in Sumatra, by the way. There was actually quite a lot. Nias was at the time considered very photogenic, and so there's a lot of photographs and a lot of postcards that were sold in Amsterdam and in a lot of places in Europe of these spectacular people and adorned in their local dress. So that was not that unusual, but Ho Teng Lin was a very good photographer. His camera was actually quite primitive, but he took a lot of photographs, sold them to other collectors, and he actually sold some of them to Dr. Wirtz from Switzerland, I think. And very often Ho Teng Lin's photographs are attributed to other people than himself, either Dr. Wirtz or Agner Møller himself, but they're not. They are his doing. And his photographs actually meant that when they were sent to Copenhagen, the Carlsberg Foundation in Copenhagen, the largest private foundation in Copenhagen, in Denmark, which is basically paid by the Carlsberg breweries, when they saw these photographs, they said, "This is so unusual and so spectacular that we want to fund this collecting of objects." So Ho Teng Lin is also a very big part of our collection. At the time that Agner Møller was there, there had been this. There had been a lot of there had been Catholic missionaries as early as 1850, but it was with the Dutch Reformed Church that everything really changed. There was a surge of people who became Christians, and that meant that at the time that Agner Møller was on Nias, he was not allowed just to take the objects. That's a myth that the Nias objects were stolen, because the Dutch authorities didn't want to have any problems. It had been so difficult to suppress the Niasians, not least in the south, that they wanted peace and quiet. So Agner Møller had to buy the objects, and he had to go into a negotiation and pay the price that he was asked. But of course it was easier because quite a lot of the local people had become Christians. So some of the objects didn't have that, it didn't have that importance for them anymore. But there was one interesting thing that he was not able to buy, and you can clearly see a very important object in this photograph. The swords are adorned with this rattan ball with either tiger teeth or claws or crocodile teeth or what have you, and in the middle of the rattan ball there is a magical object. That could be a tiger tooth or a shark's tooth, and in some cases even a European porcelain doll's head. And Agner Møller, he bought several swords, but he was never able to buy one with the rattan ball and with the magical objects. And he tried, he wanted to pay anything to buy these swords. But the Nielsen said that was the most important thing of their possession. It wasn't the forefather figures or anything else. It was this sword with the magical objects. So we have several swords from the collection, but we have none with the adornment. And Agner Møller actually asked Thomas Thomsen whether he could buy some polar bear teeth on Greenland, and have them put on the swords when they arrived to Denmark. I've gone through our collection and I've seen all the swords we have, and unfortunately there's no polar teeth on the swords. That would have been quite spectacular and quite an interesting story, I think, but there's none. So those sorts we don't have, but basically we have everything else. And I'm just going to show you, in succession, some of the photographs that Ho Teng Lin took. This is, for instance, this is the chief's son in Hylle and Hylle is a very important village for the National Museum Copenhagen, and I will show you later on why. He photographed the locals and some of the buildings, but some of the photographs that we find are very interesting today is photographs like this, because here they clearly are adorned traditionally, but they are also having rifles. And as you can see, the gentleman in the middle is wearing what the British call the boater, a straw hat. And that means this photograph is actually also documentation of a Dutch presence, and that culture was changing since he took that hat on. There's no doubt that the reason why he's wearing that hat, because he's clearly a respected warrior. He has the headhunter necklace on, and he has his weapons. He was a respected warrior, and he of course felt that this hat was had a value and made him even more how should I say respected. So we find photographs like this very interesting. I can tell you that in this museum there were at one point a tradition that if people weren't dressed completely authentic or local, those photographs would be thrown away. And I have a typical example that one of our chief curators in the 60s, he had two photographs from East Africa. And there was a Kikuyu warrior who at one photograph was standing with a lion spear, and on the other photograph, he was standing with his British Raleigh bicycle. And the photograph with the bicycle was thrown away because at the time they felt that it was sort of a pollution. They wanted the sort of the noble savage. They didn't want the image being polluted by European objects. Today we find those kind of photographs even more interesting than photographs that are just staged. This is another interesting photograph. This is actually Agner Møller's own son, photographed with the two chiefs that came to the village where Agner Møller was staying at the time. And of course, Agner Møller wanted his son to be adorned as a chief's son. He actually gave his children both Danish names, but also invented names that were connected with Nias. Also, one of the spectacular photographs, and most of these houses are still standing. They're very difficult to restore today because there are not many large trees back, unfortunately, on the island. So these huge timbers are very difficult to replace. Photograph here is also very interesting. Look at the little boy, probably the warrior's own son that he's proudly presenting for the photographer, but he's wearing a European hat, and he himself is wearing, if you look very closely, seems to be an advertisement for French champagne. So that is also a small element of how the culture was changing. But often people talk about culture that is very original and has never changed, but all cultures change. I mean, they are wearing rifles, and they got those rifles from the Portuguese. And also look at their moustache. There's a theory that their moustaches, they originate from the Portuguese, because the first Portuguese that arrived, 15th, 16th century, they wore moustaches, of course, and the locals, they actually try to recreate that. There's also another theory that some of the houses are actually a way of in the south, because they are completely different in the south than they are on the north, that some of the houses, they actually are a reconstruction or a way of trying to present the parts of a Portuguese ships. And it's quite interesting if you see some of the carvings in the large chiefs' houses. You would see anchor chains and anchors, and believe me, there are not many anchor chains and anchors on Nias. So why do they have them in the houses? They were probably seen on the huge Portuguese ships and later recreated in the houses. I've seen them myself, and we even have examples of them in these museums. Also, a typical photograph. They photographed one of the Ho Teng Lin photographed one of the local chiefs, and the chiefs, of course, want to be presented with this gold, because gold is very important on Nias. It's very prestigious, and he also had on his sign written how much gold he had. This is also quite interesting, because gold is so important, but it's also part of the history of how Nias has been a trading center. You know, one of the reasons why the Danish National Museum and Thomas Thomsen want to collect objects from Nias was that he had an idea of that Nias was one of the islands in the world that had been completely isolated from the world. But there is no gold on Nias. They had to trade gold. So the gold in itself is documentation of the fact that Nias traded with the not least Arabic traders. What did they trade in? The sad story, or the sad side of the story, is they traded with slaves. And it was before the European and the Dutch arrived. They traded in human cargo and got gold instead. But nonetheless, here we have gold in all its glory. This was a very important chief. Fortunately, we know, because Agner Møller, who was not a professional, didn't know how to collect. So he tried his best, and to be sure that he documented everything. He wrote about everything, so we know some of the persons with names who are on the photographs, and we know the villages, and so the photographs are fantastic documentation. This is the village Hyllmondegrejre, and it more or less looks like this today, except there's no chief's house, as you can see in the middle, because Agner Møller actually wrote home and said, you know, Thomas, I've actually found a fantastic thing in the village of Hyllmondegrejre. The chief's house is populated, but the family living there are not the chief's family anymore. There's a new chief in the village. He lives in another house, and the house is crumbling. And if we don't buy it, I fear the Dutch will ask them to tear it down. So they actually went into a discussion of how to buy the house. And here you can see the chief's houses, how they looked closely on Nias. They are spectacular. And I, to be honest, you should all go there if you haven't visited, because the villages, their architecture and the chief's houses are definitely worth a visit. They are magnificent and enormous. This is actually the owner standing in front of the house, proudly showing his sword and having his hand on the sword as a true warrior. This is one of the photographs that actually made the Carlsberg Foundation saying we ought to buy this house. They were they were, how should I say, they found that these photographs were magical. And the board actually said to Thomas Thomsen, but you know, this is like a Rembrandt. I mean, the people and the lighting and so on. And also remember that Ho Teng Lin photographed with a very, very primitive camera. So they were amazed when they saw photographs like this. So Agner Møller actually bought the house, and as you can see, it wasn't in a very good state. The myth is that we have the house. We don't have the house today. Agner Møller and Ho Teng Lin tore the house down, but they only took the carvings. But on Nias, there is a myth that we have the house. We don't have it. At one point, there were a discussion between the embassy in Copenhagen, the Indonesian embassy, and the National Museum in Copenhagen, approximately 15 years ago, whether they should have the house back. And we made a investigation, and we could tell them we don't have the house. The reason why people thought we had the house was that when the objects arrived in the museum, parts of the house was reconstructed by the museum's own carpenters, but would we only have the carvings in the house? I'm seeing only the carvings because, believe me, the carvings are spectacular. They were very prominently displayed in the museum. This is, of course, from the old museums, but most of the objects were displayed in the museum. I'm very sad to tell you that very few objects are displayed today. I think it's approximately 8 or 10 objects that are on display today. The National Museum we have approximately 4 million objects, and the ethnographical collections have approximately 250,000 ethnographical objects, 250,000 archaeological objects, and then approximately 250,000 photographs. So a very small amount is actually on display. And if you ask me how is the future of this collection and how is the future of the ethnographical objects in the museum, I'm very sad to say that the ethnographical collections in Copenhagen, which is actually we are the oldest ethnographical museum in the world, doesn't have a very central standing in the museum. The museum is going to be rebuilt. We have on display now 44,000 objects, and that is going to be changed to display approximately 4,500 objects, and out of them only approximately 100 to 150 objects are going to be on display as the plans are now. And that is very sad, of course, when you have these spectacular objects. And in this department, we have cooperated with people on Nias, not least our former curator, who is not in the museum anymore. She's employed at the University of Copenhagen. Bente Wolf worked very closely with the embassy and people on Nias, and we don't do that either anymore due to lack of resources. So what is the future of the collection? I can't tell you. We'll just have to see. Agner Møller returned alive from Nias. It didn't go well with him. His economy was bad, and he brought home his wife from Nias, and she had huge problems and ended up in an asylum actually, and he left her in this asylum. And after the Second World, she was not able to return because she was no longer a citizen of Dutch East India, and she was not a citizen of the Netherlands, and she was neither a citizen of Denmark. She was actually kept in this asylum, and she died in the 70s. Very, very tragic. And Agner Møller was actually sailing for the merchant navy during the war for the Allies, but he was also interned by the British at one point because he had National Socialist sympathies, and his life after the war is very, very tragic. The book I've written is basically written with sources that the family has donated, and I'm very grateful for that. So, and the reason why I wrote the story about Agner Møller because you could write about the collection in itself. But you know, I try to tell that yes, it is objects regarding the culture of Nias, but it's also the history of how the Danish state want to document this culture, and it's also the history of the man behind collecting it. So you have different layers of stories connected with the collection, and Agner Møller he's a very strong part of that. And let me just end by saying that it's quite interesting when you visit Nias, especially the local villages on Nias, and not least when you visit Hylle, because they still remember Agner Møller. And even though we have forgotten Agner Møller in Denmark, they have not. And when you are a Dane visiting Hylle, they actually believe you are a family member of Agner Møller that has returned to visit the village. And I can just end by saying, as I said before, I recommend all of you going. There's still a lot to see. There's still a lot of buildings, a lot of villages, and a lot of local culture to experience. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and we would love to take the advice of traveling to Nias, of course.